the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where tradition runs deeper than bloodlines and secrets lurk behind every gilded door, a single moment would shatter the carefully constructed facade of royal perfection forever. Princess Elena, beloved by the people and cherished by the crown, had always been the kingdom's brightest star. But when her innocent laughter turned to terrified screams in the palace gardens, and her trembling finger pointed toward the one person no one dared to question, the very foundations of the monarchy began to crumble. What happened in those few minutes would expose a web of lies that had been carefully woven for decades. It would force a loyal guard to choose between his oath to the crown and his duty to protect an innocent child. It would reveal that sometimes the greatest threats to a kingdom come not from outside its walls, but from within the very heart of power itself. This is the story of how one child's courage to speak the truth brought down the most powerful woman in the realm, and how a kingdom learned that not all monsters wear crowns, but some hide behind them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Valdoria Palace as Captain Marcus Thorne adjusted his ceremonial sword and began his daily rounds. For 15 years he had served as the head of the royal guard, protecting the Valdorian royal family with unwavering loyalty. His weathered face bore the scars of battles fought in service to the crown, and his steel-grey eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the opulent halls he called home. King Alexander III sat upon the ancient throne of stars, his presence commanding even in the early hours of dawn. Beside him stood his second wife, Queen Regent Isabella. Her sharp features framed by perfectly arranged auburn hair. She had married into the royal family 5 years prior, bringing with her a dowry that had saved the kingdom from financial ruin and a political alliance that had ended decades of border disputes with neighboring Astoria. Princess Elena, the king's daughter from his first marriage, played quietly in the corner of the throne room. At 8 years old, she possessed the same gentle blue eyes as her late mother, Queen Catherine, who had died tragically in a riding accident 3 years earlier. The little princess had struggled to adjust to her new stepmother, but the court had attributed this to the natural grief of a child who had lost her beloved mother. Captain Thorne watched as Queen Isabella's gaze lingered on the child, her expression unreadable. There had been whispers among the staff, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. The servants spoke of strange sounds coming from the princess's chambers at night, of bruises that appeared and disappeared, of a once joyful child who had grown increasingly withdrawn and fearful. The captain had attempted to address these concerns with the king on several occasions, but Alexander seemed oblivious to any problems within his household. He was consumed with matters of state, trade negotiations, and the constant pressure of maintaining Valdoria's position among the great kingdoms. Queen Isabella had masterfully positioned herself as his most trusted advisor, and her influence over the monarch had grown exponentially in the months following their marriage. As the morning progressed, Princess Elena wandered into the palace gardens, her favorite sanctuary since her mother's death. The gardens had been Queen Catherine's pride and joy, filled with rare flowers from across the known world, and maintained by a dedicated staff who remembered their former queen with reverence. Elena often spoke to her mother's portrait, which hung in a small alcove surrounded by white roses, seeking comfort and guidance from the woman who could no longer protect her. Captain Thorne followed at a respectful distance, as was his duty when any member of the royal family ventured outside the main palace. He positioned himself near the garden's entrance, where he could observe the princess while remaining unobtrusive. From his vantage point, he could see Elena kneeling beside a fountain, her small hands trailing in the cool water as she whispered words too quiet for him to hear. The tranquility of the morning was shattered when Queen Isabella appeared on the garden path, her silk gown rustling against the stone walkway. Her approach was deliberate, her face set in an expression that Captain Thorne had learned to recognize as dangerous. The Queen Regent had a way of moving that reminded him of a predator stalking its prey, graceful and calculated in every step. Elena looked up as her stepmother approached, and even from his position near the garden entrance, Captain Thorne could see the child tense with fear. The princess attempted to stand and curtsy as court protocol demanded, but her movements were hesitant and clumsy. Queen Isabella's voice carried across the garden, though her words were too quiet for the captain to distinguish their meaning. What followed would be burned into Marcus Thorne's memory for the rest of his life. He watched as Queen Isabella reached out toward the child, her hand moving in what appeared to be a gentle gesture. But Princess Elena's reaction was immediate and visceral. The child stumbled backward, her face contorting with terror, and released a scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the peaceful morning. The sound was not merely one of surprise or momentary fear, but rather the desperate cry of a soul in mortal danger. It was the kind of scream that spoke of experiences no child should ever endure, of pain that had been building for months beneath a carefully maintained facade of royal propriety. Princess Elena collapsed to her knees beside the fountain, her small body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest parts of her being. Captain Thorne moved without conscious thought, his years of training taking over as he strode across the garden toward the unfolding scene. As he approached, he could see Queen Isabella standing over the crying child, her face a mask of concern that did not quite reach her eyes. The Queen Regent was speaking in soothing tones, reaching out as if to comfort the princess, but Elena recoiled from her touch as if it burned. Through her tears, the princess looked up and saw Captain Thorne approaching. Something in his steady presence seemed to give her the courage she had been lacking for so long. With a voice that shook but carried clearly across the garden, Princess Elena pointed a trembling finger at her stepmother and spoke the words that would change everything. "She hurt me," the child whispered. Then louder, with growing strength, "She hurt me. She hurts me when Papa isn't looking. She tells me terrible things and says no. One will believe me because she's the queen." The accusations hung in the air like a poisonous fog, transforming the beautiful garden into a battlefield where truth and power would clash with devastating consequences. Queen Isabella's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath, before she quickly composed herself and turned to face the approaching guard captain.
"The child is clearly distraught," Isabella said smoothly, her voice carrying the authority of her position.
"Perhaps she's been having nightmares again. You know how children can confuse dreams with reality, especially after experiencing trauma like the loss of a parent." But Captain Thorne had seen the moment when the mask had slipped, had witnessed the flash of something predatory in the Queen Regent's eyes. More importantly, he had spent enough time around Princess Elena to know the difference between a child's fantasy and the desperate truth of someone crying out for help. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle began falling into place in his mind. The mysterious bruises, the child's increasing withdrawal, the way Elena flinched whenever her stepmother entered a room. Princess Elena struggled to her feet, her small hands clenched into fists as she faced the woman who had tormented her in silence for so long. "I'm not lying," she declared, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She pinches me and pulls my hair when no one can see. She told me that if I ever told Papa, she would make sure I disappeared like Mama did. She said Mama's accident wasn't really an accident." The final accusation struck like lightning, illuminating darker possibilities that Captain Thorne had never dared to consider. Queen Catherine's death had been thoroughly investigated at the time, ruled a tragic accident when her horse had been spooked during a routine ride through the royal forest. But now, faced with a terrified child's testimony and his own growing suspicions about the woman who had taken Catherine's place, Marcus began to see patterns he had previously missed. Queen Isabella's composure cracked further as she realized the gravity of what was unfolding. "These are the fantasies of a disturbed child," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Captain Thorne, surely you cannot give credence to such wild accusations from a little girl who clearly needs psychiatric care." The captain stepped closer to Princess Elena, positioning himself between the child and her stepmother in a gesture that was both protective and symbolic. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, his voice respectful but firm, "I believe it would be best if we all return to the palace so that these matters can be properly addressed by His Majesty the King." It was at that moment that Queen Isabella made the critical error that would seal her fate. Perhaps it was panic, or perhaps it was the arrogance of someone who had grown accustomed to wielding power without consequence. But she reached out toward Princess Elena with movements that were anything but gentle. Her fingers, adorned with the royal rings of her station, moved toward the child's arm with clear intent to silence her through force. Captain Thorne's reaction was immediate and decisive. His strong hand closed around the Queen Regent's wrist, stopping her motion mere inches from the terrified princess. The contact was brief but unmistakable in its meaning. For the first time in Valdorian history, a member of the royal guard had physically restrained a sitting monarch. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of loyal service, "I cannot allow you to lay hands on the princess while these allegations remain unresolved." The garden fell silent except for Princess Elena's quiet sobbing and the distant sound of birds singing in the trees that Queen Catherine had planted years before. Three people stood frozen in a tableau that would be remembered in Valdorian history as the moment when the facade of royal perfection finally crumbled, revealing the rot that had been festering beneath. Queen Isabella stared at the captain's hand on her wrist, her mind racing as she calculated her options. She was intelligent enough to realize that her careful plans were unraveling rapidly, but too proud to submit quietly to the accusations of a child she had underestimated. The next few moments would determine not only her own fate, but the future of the entire kingdom. Princess Alina looked up at Captain Thorne with eyes full of hope and terror, seeing in him the protector she had desperately needed for so long. The child had finally found the courage to speak her truth, but she understood instinctively that the battle for justice was only just beginning. The forces that had kept her silent for so long would not surrender without a fight, and the price of victory might be higher than anyone could imagine. As the three figures remained locked in their tense confrontation, the shadows in the garden seemed to grow longer, as if the very kingdom itself was holding its breath to see how this moment of truth would unfold. The crown's shadow had been exposed to the light at last. But darkness has a way of fighting back when cornered, and Queen Isabella was far from ready to surrender the power she had worked so hard to obtain. The morning that had begun with such peaceful promise had transformed into something far more dangerous and complex. In the silence of the garden, surrounded by the flowers that had once brought Queen Catherine such joy, the future of Valdoria balanced on the edge of a knife, waiting to see which way the blade would fall. The tension in the garden stretched like a bowstring about to snap, as Captain Thorne maintained his grip on Queen Isabella's wrist. The Queen Regent's eyes blazed with a fury that transformed her beautiful features into something altogether more sinister. For years she had carefully crafted her public image as the grieving kingdom's salvation, the noble woman who had stepped in to provide stability after Queen Catherine's tragic death. Now, faced with the crumbling of her carefully constructed facade, Isabella's true nature began to emerge like poison seeping through cracks in marble. "Remove your hand from my person immediately," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "I am your queen, and you forget yourself, Captain. These accusations from a disturbed child do not give you license to manhandle royalty." But Marcus Thorne had served the crown long enough to understand the difference between true nobility and its counterfeit. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, and that oath extended most especially to those who could not protect themselves. Princess Elena cowered behind him, her small hands clutching at his ceremonial cloak as she sought shelter from the woman who had terrorized her in the shadows of the palace. "My oath is to protect all members of the royal family, Your Majesty," he replied steadily, finally releasing her wrist, but maintaining his protective stance in front of the child. "That includes Princess Elena, who's made serious accusations that must be investigated." Queen Isabella rubbed her wrist where his fingers had briefly restrained her, her mind racing through possible strategies. She was cunning enough to recognize that brute force had failed, and that her position required a more subtle approach. The Queen Regent straightened her shoulders and assumed the regal bearing that had served her so well in the court, though those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her inner turmoil. "Very well," she said, her voice regaining some of its earlier smoothness. "If the child insists on making these outrageous claims, then we shall indeed present them to His Majesty. I am confident that King Alexander will see through these fantasies for what they truly are, the desperate attention-seeking of a troubled girl who was never properly adjusted to her mother's death." Princess Elena emerged slightly from behind Captain Thorne's protective bulk, her tear-stained face showing a determination that belied her young years. "I'm not making it up," she said, her voice small but clear. "I can prove it. She has a special room in the tower where she takes me. She has things there, scary things that she uses to hurt me. And she keeps Mama's jewelry there, the pieces that Papa said were lost in the accident." This revelation hit Captain Thorne like a physical blow. Queen Catherine's jewelry had indeed gone missing after her death, precious pieces that had been in the royal family for generations. The official explanation had been that they were lost in the chaos following the Queen's accident, perhaps dropped during the frantic rescue attempts, or stolen by opportunistic servants. But if Princess Elena was telling the truth, then Queen Isabella had been accumulating trophies of her predecessor's demise. The Queen Regent's face went pale at this accusation, her carefully maintained composure slipping another degree. "The child is clearly delusional," she said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "These are the fantasies of a grief-stricken mind. Surely you cannot believe such preposterous claims, Captain." But Marcus Thorne was beginning to believe a great deal more than he would have thought possible that morning. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle were assembling themselves in his mind, creating a picture that made his blood run cold. He thought of all the times he had found Princess Elena in tears, all the explanations that had seemed plausible at the time but now took on a much more sinister cast. How many nights had the child suffered in silence, while the adults around her failed to see the truth? "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "if Princess Elena can indeed show us this room she speaks of, then surely that would help resolve these matters quickly. If her claims are unfounded, then no harm is done. But if there is truth to her words, there is no room, Queen Isabella snapped. But her protest came too quickly, too desperately. The child is fabricating these stories. I demand that we end this charade immediately and return to the palace, where the princess can receive the medical attention she clearly requires. Princess Elena stepped fully out from behind Captain Thorne, her young face set with a courage that would have made her late mother proud. "It's on the 3rd floor of the East Tower," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "behind the tapestry with the golden dragon. She has a key that she wears on a chain under her dress, and she told me that if I ever tried to tell anyone about the room, she would lock me in there forever with Mama's ghost." The specificity of these details struck both adults with their authenticity. Children might invent stories of monsters and magic, but they rarely fabricated such precise architectural details or complex psychological manipulation unless they had experienced them firsthand. Captain Thorne felt a cold certainty settling in his chest as he realized that Princess Elena was telling the truth about everything. Queen Isabella must have reached the same conclusion because her strategy shifted dramatically in that moment. The mask of concerned stepmother fell away entirely, replaced by something calculating and dangerous. She was a woman who had clawed her way to power through intelligence and ruthlessness, and she was not about to be brought down by the testimony of a child. "You forget yourself, Captain Thorne," she said, her voice taking on a tone of cold authority. "I am not merely the princess's stepmother. I am the Queen Regent of Valdoria, appointed by His Majesty to share in the governance of this realm. These accusations amount to treason, and I will not stand here and be subjected to the fantasies of a disturbed child and the insubordination of a guard who has clearly overstepped his bounds."
She began to move toward the garden's exit, clearly intending to end the confrontation on her terms.
But Captain Thorne had made his choice, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. He stepped smoothly into her path, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword in a gesture that was unmistakably threatening, despite its restraint. "I cannot allow you to leave, Your Majesty," he said quietly, "not until these allegations have been properly investigated." The confrontation had escalated beyond mere accusations now. Captain Thorne was effectively placing the Queen Regent under arrest, an action that could be construed as treason if he was wrong, or heroism if he was right. There was no middle ground, no safe retreat from the position he had taken. He was gambling everything on the word of an 8-year-old child, but something in Princess Elena's eyes told him it was a gamble worth taking. Queen Isabella's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the woman she had hidden beneath layers of royal protocol and carefully cultivated charm. "You have made a grave error, Captain," she snarled. "When the king hears of this outrage, you will find yourself in the dungeons." And as for this lying little brat, she turned her gaze on Princess Elena with an expression of such malevolence that the child instinctively shrank back. "The only person who will be seeing the dungeons today," came a new voice from the garden entrance, "is the one who has been terrorizing my daughter."
King Alexander stood in the archway leading to the gardens, his face a mask of barely controlled fury.
Behind him stood Sir Edmund Blackwood, the kingdom's most trusted investigator, along with 2 additional guards. The king's appearance was no coincidence. One of the garden's staff, alarmed by the sounds of conflict, had run to alert the palace guard, who had immediately sought out the monarch. Queen Isabella's face went through a rapid series of expressions as she processed this new development. Relief flashed briefly as she saw her husband, followed quickly by calculation as she prepared to spin the situation to her advantage. But there was something in the king's expression that gave her pause, a coldness she had never seen directed at her before. "Alexander, darling," she began, her voice taking on the honeyed tones that had served her so well in their private moments. "Thank goodness you're here. The captain has lost his mind and your daughter has been telling the most terrible lies. I was trying to comfort her when she began screaming and making these awful accusations." But King Alexander's attention was focused entirely on his daughter, who had run to him the moment he appeared. He knelt down to her level, his large hands gentle as they framed her tear-stained face. "Tell me what happened, my precious girl," he said softly. "Tell Papa everything." Princess Elena looked up at her father with eyes that held both hope and terror. For so long, she had been told that no one would believe her, that speaking out would only bring more pain. But here was her father, the most powerful man in the kingdom, asking her to trust him with the truth. "She hurts me, Papa," Elena whispered, then louder as her father's encouraging nod gave her strength. "She's been hurting me since Mama died. She has a secret room where she takes me, and she has Mama's necklaces and rings that you said were lost. She told me that if I ever told you, she would make sure I had an accident like Mama did. She said Mama's accident wasn't really an accident at all. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. King Alexander's face went through its own transformation as he processed his daughter's testimony, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind, just as they had for Captain Thorne. The king was not a stupid man, merely one who had been blinded by grief and political necessity. Now, faced with his daughter's desperate plea for help, he began to see events with terrible clarity. Queen Isabella watched her carefully constructed world crumble around her, as her husband's expression grew colder with each word from Princess Elena's lips. She had gambled everything on her ability to manipulate the king, to maintain her position through a combination of political value and emotional manipulation. But her father's love for his child was proving stronger than her carefully woven web of influence. "These are lies," she said desperately, but her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. "The child is clearly mentally disturbed. She needs medical treatment, not indulgence of these fantasies." Sir Edmund Blackwood stepped forward, his sharp features set in an expression of professional interest. As the kingdom's chief investigator, he had seen enough deception to recognize its signs, and Queen Isabella was displaying many of them. "Your Majesty," he addressed the king, "perhaps we should examine this room that the princess has described. If it exists as she claims, it would provide valuable evidence one way or another." King Alexander stood slowly, his daughter still clinging to his side as he fixed his wife with a stare that could have frozen fire. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice carrying a promise of retribution that made even the experienced guards take notice. "I think that would be most illuminating indeed. The procession that formed to investigate Princess Elena's claims was unlike anything in Voldorian royal history." The king himself led the way, his daughter's hand firmly in his, as they moved through the palace corridors. Captain Thorne flanked them protectively, while Sir Edmund and his guards surrounded Queen Isabella, who walked with the rigid posture of a condemned woman trying to maintain her dignity. As they climbed the stairs toward the East Tower, Queen Isabella's mind raced through possible escape routes and explanations. She was intelligent enough to know that if the room existed as Elena described, her fate was sealed. But she was also cunning enough to have prepared for such possibilities, and she began to formulate one final desperate gambit that might yet save her from the consequences of her actions. The corridors of the palace had never seemed longer as the group made their way toward what might prove to be the final revelation in this unfolding drama. Behind them, word was spreading through the servant quarters like wildfire. The Queen Regent was being escorted under guard, the princess had made accusations, and the very stability of the kingdom hung in the balance. Princess Elena walked beside her father, with steps that grew more confident with each passing moment. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe, protected by the man she loved most in the world and the loyal guard who had chosen to believe her when it mattered most. The nightmare that had consumed her young life was finally coming to an end, but she understood instinctively that the most dangerous moments were still ahead. As they reached the third floor of the East Tower, the group paused before a tapestry depicting a golden dragon in flight, its jeweled eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with ancient wisdom. Princess Elena pointed with a small finger that barely trembled, her voice clear and strong as she spoke the words that would change everything. "It's behind there, Papa. That's where she takes me. That's where Mama's things are hidden." The tapestry depicting the golden dragon had hung in the East Tower for over a century, commissioned by King Alexander's grandfather to commemorate a great victory in the War of the Three Crowns. Now, as the royal party stood before it in tense silence, the ancient artwork seemed to mock them with its representation of triumph over evil. Sir Edmund Blackwood approached the tapestry with the methodical precision of a man who had spent his career uncovering hidden truths. Queen Isabella stood rigid among her escorts, her face a mask of defiant composure even as her mind raced through rapidly diminishing options. She had always prided herself on being several moves ahead of her opponents. But the combination of Princess Elena's unexpected courage and Captain Thorne's moral conviction had upset all of her carefully laid plans. Still, she was not ready to surrender without one final gambit. "This is absurd," she declared, her voice carrying across the corridor with practiced authority. "We are dignifying the fantasies of a traumatized child by searching for imaginary rooms behind tapestries. Alexander, surely you can see how this reflects on the stability of our rule. What will the court think when they hear that the king allowed himself to be led on a treasure hunt by his daughter's nightmares? But King Alexander's attention remained fixed on his daughter, whose small hand pointed steadily at the tapestry. The child's certainty was unshakable, and there was something in her manner that spoke of hard-earned knowledge rather than childish imagination. The king had spent enough time around courtiers and diplomats to recognize the difference between truth and deception, and his daughter's testimony rang with authenticity that could not be manufactured. Sir Edmund examined the edges of the tapestry with careful attention, his experienced fingers probing for hidden mechanisms or concealed hinges. The wall behind appeared to be solid stone, masterfully crafted blocks that had stood for generations without revealing any secrets. But as his investigation continued, he noticed something that made him pause, a slight discoloration in the mortar around one particular section, as if it had been recently disturbed and carefully concealed. Princess Elena watched the proceedings with growing anxiety, her young mind grappling with the possibility that her stepmother might somehow escape justice once again. The child had lived for so long with the terror of being disbelieved that even her father's support felt fragile and temporary. She tugged on King Alexander's sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper, as she shared another crucial detail. "She has a key, Papa," Elena said urgently. "She wears it on a golden chain under her dress. She always touches it when she's angry, like she's making sure it's still there." All eyes turned to Queen Isabella, whose hand instinctively moved towards her throat before she caught herself. The gesture was small but unmistakable, and Sir Edmund noted it with the sharp attention of a man trained to observe human behavior under stress. Captain Thorne stepped forward slightly, positioning himself to prevent any attempt at flight or concealment. "Your Majesty," Sir Edmund addressed the Queen with formal courtesy that nonetheless carried an undertone of suspicion, "would you be so kind as to show us this chain that the princess has described?"
If it exists as she claims, it would help us verify her testimony one way or another.
Queen Isabella's eyes flashed with something between fury and panic as she realized how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. Every detail that Princess Elena provided proved accurate, building an increasingly damning case against her. The Queen Regent had always relied on her superior intelligence and political acumen to navigate difficult situations, but she was discovering that the simple truth spoken by a child could be more powerful than any elaborate deception. "I will not be subjected to a search of my person based on the ravings of a disturbed child," she declared haughtily. "I am your queen, Alexander, and I demand that you put an end to this humiliation immediately." But King Alexander's expression had hardened with each passing moment, the transformation from loving husband to stern monarch complete. "You are my wife, Isabella," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "But you are also a subject of this realm, and no subject is above investigation when accused of crimes against the royal family. Sir Edmund, please proceed with your examination." The investigator approached Queen Isabella with professional detachment, his movements careful and respectful despite the circumstances. Isabella backed away instinctively, but found her retreat blocked by the guards who had positioned themselves around her. For the first time since the confrontation began, genuine fear flickered across her features as she realized that her position would not protect her from the consequences of her actions. "I will scream," she threatened desperately. "I will bring the entire palace guard running, and you will have to explain to the court why you assaulted your queen based on a child's fantasies." "Scream if you wish," King Alexander replied coldly. "But understand that Captain Thorne and Sir Edmund act with my full authority in this matter. Any interference with their investigation will be treated as an act of treason against the crown." Faced with this ultimatum, Queen Isabella found herself trapped by the very system she had manipulated so successfully for years. Her political cunning, which had served her so well in acquiring power, offered no escape from the inexorable logic of justice. With shaking hands, she reached beneath the neckline of her elaborate gown and withdrew a golden chain, at the end of which hung an ornate key unlike any other in the palace. Princess Elena gasped at the sight of the key, her memory flooding back with painful clarity. "That's it, Papa. That's the key she uses. She always makes me hold it while she—" The child's words trailed off as tears began to flow again, the traumatic memories too overwhelming to articulate fully. King Alexander gathered his daughter into his arms, his own eyes blazing with a fury that promised terrible retribution for those who had harmed his child. Captain Thorne moved to take custody of the key, while Sir Edmund returned his attention to the tapestry with renewed urgency. If Princess Elena's testimony about the key proved accurate, then everything else she had claimed was likely to be true as well. The investigator's examination of the wall behind the tapestry became more focused as he used the key to guide his search. The ornate metalwork was clearly designed for a specific lock, its unique shape suggesting a mechanism hidden somewhere in the ancient stonework. After several minutes of careful probing, Sir Edmund's persistence was rewarded when he discovered a small keyhole cunningly concealed within the carved decorations of the wall itself. The key turned smoothly in the hidden lock, indicating frequent use, and the sound of well-oiled mechanisms echoed in the corridor as a section of the wall swung silently inward. The revelation of the secret room struck the assembled group like a physical blow, confirming Princess Elena's testimony in the most dramatic possible way. Even Captain Thorne, who had believed the child's story completely, felt his breath catch as the hidden chamber was revealed. The room beyond was small but meticulously organized, its contents arranged with the obsessive care of someone who took pride in their collection. Shelves lined the walls, displaying items that told the story of Queen Isabella's true nature with horrifying clarity. There were instruments whose purpose was unmistakably sinister, devices designed to inflict pain while leaving minimal evidence. There were vials containing substances that Sir Edmund recognized as rare poisons, some of which had been thought lost to history, but it was the far wall that drew their attention most powerfully, where Queen Catherine's missing jewelry was displayed like trophies in a twisted shrine to murder. The pieces glittered in the light from the corridor, their beauty unmarred by the evil that surrounded them. Among them hung the sapphire necklace that had been Catherine's favorite, the one she had worn on the day of her final, fatal ride through the royal forest. King Alexander stared at his first wife's jewelry with an expression of grief and rage that seemed to age him years in moments. These were pieces he had searched for desperately after Catherine's death, hoping to preserve them as mementos of their love for their daughter to inherit. To see them displayed as trophies in Queen Isabella's secret chamber of horrors was a violation that struck at the very core of his being. Princess Elena peered into the room from her father's arms, her young face set in lines of grim satisfaction despite her tears. "See, Papa, I told you she had Mama's things. She used to make me touch them while she hurt me, and she would tell me stories about what really happened to Mama in the forest that day." The implications of this revelation hit everyone present with devastating force. Queen Catherine's death had not been an accident at all, but a carefully orchestrated murder designed to clear the way for Isabella's rise to power. The woman they had trusted, the one who had been given access to the highest levels of government and the most intimate family moments, was not just a child abuser, but a regicide who had killed her way to the throne. Queen Isabella watched her carefully constructed world crumble around her as the contents of her secret room were exposed to the light. For years, she had maintained this hidden sanctuary as both a practical workspace and a psychological refuge, a place where she could drop all pretenses and revel in the power she had accumulated through violence and deception. Now, surrounded by the evidence of her crimes, she faced the reality that her reign of terror was finally coming to an end. But Isabella was not a woman who surrendered easily, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of her guilt. As the shock of discovery began to wear off, her mind started working through possibilities for escape or mitigation. She was still the Queen Regent of Valdoria, still possessed of considerable political connections and financial resources. If she could somehow survive the immediate crisis, there might yet be opportunities to rebuild her position or flee to friendlier territory. Sir Edmund began documenting the contents of the room with methodical precision, his trained eye cataloguing each piece of evidence that would be needed to build an unassailable case against the Queen Regent. The investigator had handled many complex cases in his career, but never one with such far-reaching implications for the stability of the realm. This was not merely a matter of criminal justice, but a constitutional crisis that could shake the foundations of the monarchy itself. Captain Thorne stood guard at the entrance to the secret chamber, his hand resting on his sword hilt as he watched Queen Isabella for any sign of desperate action. The captain had crossed his own Rubicon by choosing to believe Princess Elena's accusations, and he was prepared to see the matter through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal consequences. His oath to protect the royal family had taken precedence over his duty to obey his superiors, and he felt a grim satisfaction in knowing he had made the right choice. As the full scope of Queen Isabella's crimes became apparent, King Alexander found himself grappling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his royal composure. The woman he had trusted with his kingdom and his daughter's care had betrayed that trust in the most horrific possible way. She had murdered his beloved Catherine, terrorized his innocent child, and manipulated him with skills that spoke of years of practice in deception and violence. The discovery of the secret room marked the end of Queen Isabella's reign of terror, but it also marked the beginning of a new crisis for the Kingdom of Valdoria. The revelation that their Queen Regent was a murderer and child abuser would send shockwaves through the court and the realm. raising questions about the stability of the monarchy and the competence of those who had failed to detect the evil in their midst. Princess Elena clung to her father as the adults around her processed the implications of what they had discovered. The child felt a mixture of vindication and terror, knowing that while her ordeal was finally ending, the woman who had tormented her was far from powerless. Isabella's network of supporters and co-conspirators remained unknown, and there was no telling how far her corruption had spread through the halls of power. As Sir Edmund continued his methodical documentation and Captain Thorne maintained his vigilant watch, the secret room yielded up its secrets like a confession extracted under torture. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of the scope of Queen Isabella's crimes and the calculating nature of her rise to power. The kingdom of Valdoria was about to learn that sometimes the greatest threats to a realm come not from foreign enemies or natural disasters, but from the monsters who smile and bow and wear crowns while plotting in the shadows. The confrontation in the East Tower had revealed truths that would reshape the kingdom's future, but the most dangerous moments were yet to come. Queen Isabella was cornered but not yet captured, and history had shown repeatedly that wounded predators were often at their most deadly when they had nothing left to lose. The evidence contained within Queen Isabella's secret chamber painted a picture of systematic evil that exceeded even the darkest suspicions of those who had uncovered it. As Sir Edmund continued his methodical documentation, each new discovery added another layer to the web of murder and manipulation that had ensnared the royal family. Hidden compartments revealed detailed plans written in Isabella's own hand, documenting not just her past crimes, but future targets within the court who had become inconvenient to her ambitions. Among the most chilling discoveries was a leather-bound journal that chronicled Isabella's gradual poisoning of Queen Catherine over the course of several months. The entries were written with clinical detachment, noting dosages and symptoms with the precision of a medical researcher. Catherine's final accident had been merely the culmination of a long campaign of slow murder, designed to appear natural while ensuring that Isabella would be perfectly positioned to comfort the grieving king and assume power as his new wife and regent. King Alexander read excerpts from the journal with hands that shook with barely contained rage, his voice breaking as he spoke the words that documented his first wife's suffering. She writes here about Catherine's headaches, her dizzy spells, the way she would become confused during council meetings. I thought it was stress from the border disputes with Astoria. I never suspected. His words trailed off as the full scope of his failure to protect his wife became clear. Princess Elena listened to her father's voice with a mixture of vindication and sorrow, finally understanding that her beloved mother's decline had not been natural. The child had memories of her mother's increasing frailty, the way Queen Catherine would sometimes forget things or stumble during simple tasks. Isabella had been there throughout it all, the concerned stepmother-to-be who offered help and comfort while secretly orchestrating the destruction of the family she planned to replace. But the journal's revelations extended far beyond the murder of Queen Catherine. Isabella had been building a network of corruption throughout the kingdom for years, using a combination of blackmail, bribery, and strategic elimination to place her supporters in key positions. Several mysterious deaths among the nobility were revealed to be carefully orchestrated assassinations, designed to clear paths for Isabella's allies or remove potential threats to her growing power base. Sir Edmund discovered correspondence that implicated dozens of courtiers, merchants, and government officials in Isabella's schemes. Some had been willing collaborators, seduced by promises of wealth and advancement. Others had been coerced through threats against their families or exposure of compromising secrets. The corruption extended into the very heart of Valdorian society, touching everyone from senior ministers to palace servants. The scope of this conspiracy is staggering, Sir Edmund reported to the king, his usual professional composure shaken by the magnitude of what he was uncovering. She has been systematically infiltrating every aspect of the government and court. There are lists here of officials who refuse to cooperate, along with detailed plans for their elimination. Your Majesty, I fear that many people who appeared to die of natural causes or accidents were actually murdered on her orders. Captain Thorne studied the faces of the guards who had accompanied them to the tower, wondering which of them might be secretly loyal to Queen Isabella's cause. The revelation of such widespread corruption meant that trust had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Every person in the palace was now a potential threat. Every smile might conceal a blade. Every offer of help could be a trap designed to protect the Queen Regent's remaining assets. Queen Isabella herself had remained eerily calm throughout the discovery process, her initial panic giving way to a cold calculation that was somehow more frightening than her earlier desperation. She watched the systematic destruction of her carefully built empire with the detached interest of a scholar observing an experiment, occasionally offering corrections to Sir Edmund's interpretations of her various schemes. "You're reading that incorrectly," she said matter-of-factly, as the investigator examined a document detailing the planned assassination of Duke Aldrich, one of King Alexander's most trusted advisors. The poison was meant to simulate a heart attack, not a stroke. The distinction was important for maintaining plausible deniability. Her casual attitude toward mass murder was perhaps more chilling than any display of emotion would have been. Isabella spoke of her crimes with the same tone she might have used to discuss the weather, revealing a mind that had long since moved beyond normal human constraints of morality and empathy. She had become something entirely other than the grieving widow and devoted stepmother she had pretended to be. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Isabella's ultimate goal had been nothing less than the complete transformation of Valdoria into a puppet state under her control. Documents revealed correspondence with foreign powers, negotiations for military support in exchange for territorial concessions, and trade agreements that would have stripped the kingdom of its sovereignty. She had been planning to eliminate not just King Alexander, but Princess Helena as well, clearing the way for her own children to inherit a throne backed by foreign armies. The revelation that Isabella had been planning to murder Princess Helena sent King Alexander into a rage that threatened to overwhelm his royal composure entirely. The idea that he had unknowingly delivered his beloved daughter into the hands of someone who intended to kill her was almost too horrific to contemplate. Only Captain Thorne's quick intervention prevented the king from striking down his wife with his own hands. "She is going to face justice," the captain said firmly, physically restraining his monarch. "But it must be proper justice, conducted according to law and witnessed by the court. If you kill her now, her supporters could claim martyrdom and use her death to justify continued resistance to your rule." The wisdom of this counsel gradually penetrated through Alexander's fury, but the king's expression promised that justice, when it came, would be both swift and absolute. The woman who had destroyed his family and betrayed his trust would face consequences appropriate to the magnitude of her crimes, but those consequences would be delivered through proper channels rather than in a moment of uncontrolled rage. Princess Helena had grown quiet during the revelations about her planned murder, processing information that was almost beyond her young comprehension. The child understood that her stepmother was evil, but the scope of that evil was difficult for her mind to grasp fully. She clung to her father with renewed intensity, realizing how close she had come to joining her mother in death at Isabella's hands. "Papa," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the tense atmosphere of the corridor. "There are other children too. She told me about other girls who made her angry. Girls who went away and never came back." She said their families thought they ran away, but she knew better. This revelation struck the assembled group like a lightning bolt, suggesting that Isabella's crimes extended far beyond the royal family to encompass unknown numbers of innocent children throughout the realm. Sir Edmund immediately began searching through the documentation for evidence of these additional murders, his trained mind already working on the logistics of investigating crimes that might stretch back years or even decades. The evidence was there, hidden within Isabella's meticulous records, like poison concealed in honey. Lists of children from noble and merchant families who had died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances, always after coming to the attention of the Queen Regent in some way. Some had been potential rivals to Princess Helena's position, others had simply witnessed something they should not have seen, and still others appeared to have been selected almost at random to satisfy Isabella's increasingly violent impulses. King Alexander felt the weight of his failures settling on his shoulders like a crushing burden as the full scope of the disaster became clear. He had not only failed to protect his wife and daughter, but had unknowingly enabled the murder of dozens of innocent children throughout his realm. The knowledge that his trust and love had been used as weapons against his own people was almost too heavy to bear. But even as the investigation revealed the breadth of Isabella's crimes, she was already working on her final gambit. The Queen Regent had not survived years of dangerous political maneuvering without developing contingency plans for exactly this sort of crisis. While the others focused on documenting her past crimes, Isabella's mind was racing ahead to the possibilities that still remained for escape or revenge. Her network of supporters might be compromised, but they were not yet completely neutralized. Secret messages could still be sent through channels that Sir Edmund had not yet discovered, and there were resources hidden throughout the kingdom that could be mobilized if she could somehow evade immediate capture. More importantly, Isabella possessed knowledge of state secrets and foreign intelligence that could be used as bargaining chips in negotiations with enemy powers. The confrontation in the East Tower had exposed the rot at the heart of the Valdorian court, but the diseased tissue had not yet been fully excised. Queen Isabella was cornered and her crimes had been revealed, but she remained dangerous in a way that only the truly desperate could be. Her next moves would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the future of the entire kingdom. Captain Thorne recognized the signs of a predator preparing for one final strike, and he tightened his grip on his sword hilt as he watched Isabella's face for any indication of her intentions. The captain had served in enough battles to know that the enemy was never more dangerous than in the moments just before defeat, when they had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from a last desperate gamble. Sir Edmund continued his methodical documentation, but his attention was also focused on Isabella's demeanor and body language. The investigator had seen enough criminals to recognize the difference between those who had accepted their fate and those who were still planning their next move. Isabella's calm acceptance of her situation was beginning to feel less like resignation and more like the patience of a spider waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Princess Elena sensed the tension building among the adults around her, though she could not fully understand its source. The child pressed closer to her father, her instincts warning her that the danger was not yet over despite the discovery of the secret room. Isabella might be exposed, but she was not yet defeated, and the most perilous moments of this confrontation were still to come. As the evidence of Isabella's guilt mounted to overwhelming proportions, the Queen Regent finally spoke again, her voice carrying a note of cold amusement that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. "You think this ends with me?" she said quietly, her eyes fixed on King Alexander with an expression of malicious satisfaction. "You think that documenting my crimes and preparing your trials will somehow restore order to your precious kingdom? But you understand nothing about the forces you are truly dealing with." Her words carried implications that extended far beyond personal revenge, suggestions of larger conspiracies and deeper corruption that had not yet been uncovered. Isabella's final gambit was beginning to reveal itself, and it promised to be as dangerous and destructive as everything that had come before. Queen Isabella's ominous words hung in the air like a curse as the implications of her warning began to sink in. The revelation of her individual crimes had been devastating enough, but her suggestion of larger conspiracies and hidden powers promised chaos on a scale that could destabilize the entire kingdom. King Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized that the woman he had trusted with his crown and his daughter's life had been merely the visible tip of a much more dangerous iceberg.
"What forces?"
he demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "What are you talking about, Isabella?" The Queen Regent's smile was cold and predatory as she prepared to deliver her final blow against the family that had dared to challenge her power. "Did you truly believe that a mere widow from a minor noble house could have orchestrated all of this alone?" she asked mockingly. "The poisons that killed your precious Catherine, the intelligence networks that span multiple kingdoms, the resources needed to corrupt half your court, did you think these things simply materialized from thin air?" Captain Thorne stepped closer, his hand fully on his sword hilt now as he recognized the tactical shift in Isabella's approach. She was no longer trying to escape or deny her guilt, but rather attempting to use her knowledge as a weapon against the stability of the realm itself. The captain had seen this strategy employed by desperate enemies before. If they could not win, they would ensure that everyone else lost as well. Sir Edmund looked up from his documentation with growing alarm as Isabella's implications became clearer. "You're suggesting foreign involvement," he said carefully. "Astoria? The Eastern Principalities? Who has been backing your operations?" Isabella's laugh was like broken glass, sharp and cutting in the confined space of the corridor. "Backing? My dear investigator, you still don't understand. I wasn't backed by these powers. I was recruited by them, trained by them, sent here with the specific purpose of destabilizing Valdoria from within and preparing the way for conquest." The revelation struck the group like a physical blow, reframing everything they thought they understood about the situation. Isabella was not merely a murderess who had clawed her way to power through individual ambition, but rather a trained operative working as part of a larger conspiracy to destroy Valdoria from within. Her marriage to King Alexander, her systematic elimination of threats, her cultivation of corruption throughout the government, all of it had been part of a coordinated plan of conquest. King Alexander felt his legs weaken as the full implications crashed over him. He had not simply been deceived by his wife, he had been infiltrated by enemy agents who had used his trust and love as weapons against his own kingdom. The woman he had shared his bed with, confided his deepest concerns to, and trusted with the welfare of his child, had been working for foreign powers from the very beginning. Princess Elena sensed the shift in her father's demeanor and pressed closer to him, her young mind struggling to understand the adult conversation swirling around her. The child knew that her stepmother was evil, but the concept of treachery on a national scale was beyond her comprehension. All she understood was that the danger seemed to be growing rather than diminishing, despite the discovery of the secret room. The beauty of it. Isabella continued, clearly relishing the devastation her words were causing, "is that my death or imprisonment will actually accelerate the timeline. My handlers are already aware of this contingency, and they have prepared accordingly. Within days of my capture becoming public knowledge, you will find yourself facing rebellions in 3 provinces, a naval blockade of your primary trade routes, and military incursions along your eastern border." Sir Edmund's mind raced as he processed the strategic implications of Isabella's revelations. If she was telling the truth, then the Kingdom of Valdoria was facing not just a domestic crisis, but a coordinated assault by multiple foreign powers. The corruption she had cultivated within the government and military would provide perfect opportunities for enemy agents to sabotage defensive preparations, while the political chaos surrounding her downfall would distract attention from external threats. Captain Thorne stepped forward, his voice deadly calm as he addressed the Queen Regent. "You're going to tell us everything," he said quietly. "Every contact, every plan, every resource. You're going to help us identify and neutralize every aspect of this conspiracy, or I swear by the crown I serve that your death will be neither quick nor merciful." Isabella's response was another cold laugh that echoed off the stone walls of the ancient tower. "Threaten me all you like, Captain. Torture me if it makes you feel better, but understand that I am already dead from the moment my mission failed. My handlers do not tolerate failure, and they certainly do not tolerate capture. Even if you offered me immunity and protection, I would not live to see another sunrise." The matter-of-fact way she discussed her own impending death was perhaps more chilling than any of her previous revelations. Isabella had moved beyond fear or hope to a place of cold acceptance that spoke of training and indoctrination that went far deeper than mere patriotism or greed. She was a true believer in her cause, willing to sacrifice not only her own life but the lives of countless innocents to achieve her master's goals. King Alexander struggled to maintain his composure as the full scope of the disaster became apparent. His kingdom was under attack from multiple directions simultaneously, his government was riddled with enemy agents, and the woman who knew the most about the conspiracy was planning to take her secrets to the grave. The challenge facing him was no longer simply a matter of criminal justice, but rather a race against time to prevent the complete collapse of his realm. "Your Majesty," Sir Edmund said urgently, "we need to begin immediate security sweeps of all government positions. If even half of what she claims is true, then we are facing a comprehensive penetration of our entire administrative structure. Every decision we make from this point forward must assume that it will be reported to enemy intelligence within hours." The investigator's words highlighted the paranoid reality that now faced the royal household. Trust, the foundation upon which all government ultimately rested, had been shattered by Isabella's revelations. Every advisor could be a spy, every servant might be an assassin, and every ally potentially a traitor waiting for the right moment to strike. The kingdom would have to be rebuilt from the ground up, starting with the assumption that everyone was suspect until proven otherwise. But even as the adults grappled with the strategic implications of Isabella's conspiracy, Princess Elena was focused on more immediate concerns. The child had learned through bitter experience to read the subtle signs of her stepmother's moods, and she could see something building in Isabella's expression that promised imminent violence. The Queen Regent might be cornered and exposed, but she was far from powerless. "Papa," Elena whispered urgently, tugging on her father's sleeve. "She has something hidden in her dress. She keeps touching her left side the way she used to touch the key. There's something else she's been keeping secret." Captain Thorne immediately focused his attention on Isabella's movements, his trained eye catching the subtle gesture that the child had noticed. The Queen Regent's left hand kept drifting toward a particular spot on her elaborate gown, a nervous habit that suggested she was carrying something concealed in the fabric itself. Given her demonstrated skill with poisons and hidden weapons, whatever she was hiding was almost certainly dangerous. "Your Majesty," he said formally, addressing Isabella with the courtesy required by protocol even as he prepared for violence, "I must ask you to remain perfectly still while Sir Edmund conducts a more thorough search of your person. Any sudden movements will be interpreted as hostile acts." Isabella's smile widened at the captain's words, revealing an expression of malicious anticipation that transformed her beautiful features into something monstrous. "Oh, Captain," she purred, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that raised alarms in everyone present. "I'm afraid it's far too late for searches and precautions. You see, the moment you discovered my little sanctuary, certain automatic processes were set in motion." As she spoke, her hand moved with practiced precision to the concealed pocket in her gown. Withdrawing a small crystal vial filled with a liquid, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The substance within was clearly some form of poison, but its unusual appearance suggested properties that went beyond simple toxins. Isabella held the vial delicately, like a priest holding a sacred relic. "This," she announced with evident pride, "is a gift from the alchemists of the Shadow Court. One drop on the skin is sufficient to cause madness within minutes and death within hours. The beauty of it is that there is no antidote, no treatment, and no way to prevent its effects once absorbed. But the truly elegant aspect is what happens when the vial is broken." Her words sent immediate panic through the assembled group, as the implications became clear. Isabella was not simply carrying poison for her own use, but rather some form of weapon that could affect everyone in the immediate vicinity. Captain Thorne began moving to restrain her, but Isabella's next words froze him in place. "I wouldn't, Captain," she said calmly. "You see, this particular compound becomes airborne when exposed to rapid temperature changes. The heat of the human body, for instance, or the friction caused by sudden movement. Break this vial in a confined space like this corridor, and everyone present will be dead within the hour, including, of course, little Princess Elena." The standoff that followed was unlike anything in the long history of Valdorian royal protocol. A queen regent stood poised to commit mass murder in the heart of the palace, while those sworn to protect the realm found themselves paralyzed by the knowledge that any aggressive action could result in the death of the innocent child they were trying to save. Isabella had maneuvered them into an impossible position where victory and defeat had become indistinguishable. King Alexander felt his world narrowing to the space between heartbeats as he stared at the woman who held his daughter's life in her hands. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to strike down the monster who had destroyed his family, but paternal love demanded restraint that might allow her to escape justice entirely. The choice before him was not between right and wrong, but between different forms of catastrophe. Princess Elena, despite her young age, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation better than anyone else present. The child had spent years learning to read Isabella's moods and anticipate her actions, and she could see the cold calculation behind her stepmother's theatrical display. Isabella was not planning to escape. She was planning to take everyone with her into death, securing her final victory through mutual destruction. But the princess had also learned something else during her years of torment. Isabella's greatest weakness was her own arrogance. The Queen Regent believed herself to be the smartest person in any room, superior to everyone around her in cunning and foresight. That arrogance had served her well in her rise to power, but it had also created blind spots that a desperate child might be able to exploit. As the adults remained frozen in their deadly standoff, Princess Elena began to move with the careful precision of someone who had learned to survive in the presence of a predator. Her small hand reached into the folds of her dress, where she had been carrying something that Isabella had never bothered to search for. A simple silver locket that had belonged to her mother, engraved with protective symbols from the old religion. The child's plan was desperate and dangerous, relying on timing and Isabella's psychological obsession with control, but it was also the only chance they had to break the deadlock without triggering the catastrophe that the Queen Regent had prepared. Princess Elena took a deep breath, summoning all the courage her mother had passed down to her, and prepared to make the move that would determine the fate of everyone in the corridor. "Isabella?" she said quietly, her young voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You made one mistake in all your planning. You never understood what Mama really left behind." As she spoke, Elena opened the locket with a sharp click that echoed in the confined space, revealing not a portrait or keepsake, but rather a small compartment containing a powder that sparkled with its own inner light. The substance was not magical in any supernatural sense, but it was something far more dangerous to Isabella's plans. A neutralizing agent that Queen Catherine had prepared years earlier as protection against exactly the sort of exotic poisons that were now threatening her daughter's life. Isabella's eyes widened in shock and rage as she realized that her final gambit had been anticipated and countered by a woman she had murdered years before. Queen Catherine's love for her daughter had extended beyond death itself, providing protection through knowledge and preparation that Isabella's arrogance had never considered possible. The Queen Regent's expression of triumph transformed into something ugly and desperate as she understood that she had been outmaneuvered by a ghost. The powder from Elena's locket hung in the air between them like a challenge, promising neutralization of Isabella's weapon and an end to her reign of terror. But the final moments of the confrontation would require perfect timing and absolute courage from everyone involved. The crown's shadow had been exposed at last, but the light of justice still needed to overcome the darkness that threatened to consume them all.